Well, good evening. It is time for us to begin. If you'll be finding a place to be seated, we'll get started with our class tonight. We are in John chapter 2. If you'd like to be turning there, and we'll talk a little bit about what we have studied in the past couple of weeks and get you up to date with that. But I first want to start by letting you know, and we'll talk about, I'm going to go back here and get that announcement sheets while I'm thinking about it. We'll talk about in the announcements a little bit more about the particulars, but just to, by way of reminder, this will be our last Wednesday night Bible class that we'll have here for the next couple of weeks. The only thing that I hate about having to go 1 week without Bible class is going 2 weeks without Bible class, but it's for two good causes. But first of all, let me tell you that it's not for you to take 2 weeks off, okay? Next week, of course, we've got the community, I think the community worship, is that what they're calling it? That's down at the library. Bring your lawn chairs. The forecast, the good news is no rain. The bad news is it may be a little cool, but on Friday night you're going to sit out in it and watch a football game, so you might as well come out and listen to some preaching while you're at it. And but be at the library. It'll be Monday through Thursday night, and different speakers each night, and we hope you'll make your plans to be there and support that effort. And then, I don't know, Ron, do we have all the assignments taken up that we needed people to sign up for? I don't see Johnny. Is Johnny or Philip here? Philip's teaching, I think. So, anyway, then the following week is our seminar that we already had planned for Can We Trust the Bible? And Denny Petrillo will be our guest, and we're going to have that on Sunday night through Wednesday night, and we're going to have it out at the Activities Building. And the reason why we're having it out there is because we're hoping that we can use this as a way to really reach out to people that are in our community, friends and family, particularly those that you know, that you've had conversations with that say something like, well, you know, I'm not sure we can believe the Bible, or how do we know we've got everything we need? Well, that's what we're going to cover in this. And Denny Petrillo is going to be our guest speaker, and we had him come when I was preaching at Eastwood at Paris. He came and did this very same seminar, and it literally is faith-building and mind-blowing at the same time, some of the things that he'll show you with that. So I hope you'll be making your plans next week to be at the library. I hope that you are inviting people to come and be with us the following week for our Can We Trust the Bible seminar. And don't take 2 weeks off. You get a break from not having to hear me preach or teach for 2 weeks, so you can kind of catch your breath a little bit. But I hope you'll be making your plans to support those efforts and be a part of that. All right, we are in John tonight. In fact, this afternoon, Jared texted me to make sure. He said, you did remember tonight's the last time you're going to be teaching class for a couple of weeks. And I said, yeah. I said, we're going to talk about Jesus turning water to wine, and I'm going to let him mull over that for about 2 weeks, you know. And he said, attaboy. So that's where we're at. But I want to begin by saying, before we ever get into chapter 2, and then we'll back up and talk about what we've studied so far, I want to begin by saying that for the most part, we get to chapter 2 of John, and we talk about everything that John chapter 2 is not about, and never get around to talking about what it's really about. In John chapter 1, we've been introduced. Remember, John chapter 20, 30 through 31 is the verses I've told you from the beginning. You've got to remember, many other signs truly did Jesus that are not written in this book, but these are written that you may what? Believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah, is what He's trying to prove to us. And that believing you might have life in His name. See, so the purpose of the gospel is literally, sometimes people will say, well, I'm studying with so-and-so and they want to read something. What should I tell them to read? And I say John. And they say, why John? Because John tells us this is why I wrote this book. It's to get people that don't believe to believe. And so he starts off in John chapter 1. We talked about introducing all of these ideas and and things about Jesus that he's going to, I told you it was kind of like the hyperlink in Wikipedia. You're going to go back as you go through the book and you'll see something. And didn't he talk about that? And yeah, he did. We're going to do that even tonight. There'll be a little blue hyperlink if it was on Wikipedia that you would jump back to chapter 1. But in chapter 1, he introduced Jesus as being God. He introduced Jesus as being the Word, the Creator. He introduced him as being the life and the light and connected those two terms together. He introduced him as being the Lamb of God, the King of Israel, as Rabbi. All of these different ideas that he's putting out there that he's going to explain in greater detail as we go through the Gospel of John. And then we saw this other guy that he introduces for us in chapter 1, John, not the writer of the book, but the one who's a relative of Jesus, who's baptizing folks. And he's the first of many witnesses that's going to give testimony. And we talked about that's the same word in the Greek. But John is the first of many witnesses that's going to give testimony in the Gospel of John of who Jesus is. And when someone witnesses or gives testimony, or there's a sign, which is something that has a deeper spiritual meaning, then that makes people understand who Jesus is. And there's always this controversy that you'll see, this tension, that there's going to be some people that are going to believe and follow Jesus and some that won't believe and follow Jesus. And there's going to be some that may start following Jesus but turn away, and maybe some that don't follow Jesus but will later. And we've talked about those different levels of following and believing that you see in the Gospel of John. But the first thing that he does when he recognizes who Jesus is, it's confirmed by God the Father and God the Spirit that he's God the Son. I've got to follow him, and I've got to find others and tell them who he is. So he tells Andrew and another one of his disciples, and they start following him. And Andrew says, wait, I got to go tell my brother. And he tells him, and Peter starts following. And then they find Philip, and they tell him, and he starts following. But he says, wait, I got to go tell Nathanael. And they tell Nathanael, and Nathanael starts following. And that find and follow, that's the way it's supposed to work all through the book. And then at the end of all of that, we talked about it that last week at the end of class, we focused on the fact that Jesus is being presented as the bridge between earth and heaven, between mankind and God, as Jacob's ladder, as the temple. Remember the stairs, the tabernacle, the Word, God and man come together. And that's going to be further explained in chapter 2. All right? So, how are we doing? I know I'm going 100 miles an hour, but it's just full of some. I told you from the beginning, you may not like this class. I'm having a ball, so I hope you'll jump on board and take the ride with me, because it's so cool to see what John does. After he gets through with all of that, remember, there's no chapter breaks when John's writing this. The first thing that he goes into, he says, I'm writing this so that you can believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Let me first tell you who he is and how people respond to him. Now, the very first sign that he's going to tell us about is what we find here in chapter 2. And it's a unique passage in that the other gospel writers don't record this for us, but it's a really cool event for several reasons. And again, we go to this passage and we talk about a lot of other things, but most of the time we don't get down to what he's really talking about. And what he's really talking about in this section is some really cool stuff about Jesus. So let's get into it. In chapter 2 and verse 1 on the screen up there, and if you're following along in your John books, on the third day. Now, we don't really know what third day he's talking about. Is this the third day since Nathanael and he had that conversation? Is it the third day? You remember in chapter 1, he kept saying on the next day, on the next day, on the next day. Maybe it's the third day after all that. Earlier in chapter 1, I think it's verse 43, he said they started heading north. Is it the third day of their travels? I don't know. But here's what I do know. I've told you from the beginning that most of the time in Scripture, you'll hear people say, now what this represents is, and you're like, what makes you think that represents anything? When I was in high school, our English teacher that we had sophomore, junior, and senior year of high school, our average class time was that we would come in one day and she would say, read this story by whoever. Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. And then here's the questions, and the questions were always something like, what does Romeo represent? What does Juliet represent? What does Juliet's father represent? You know, all that. And then there's a test tomorrow. Any questions? And I would always go. And she would say, Corey. And I'd say, how do we know that Romeo represents that? And she'd say, well, all scholars agree on that. And I'm like, how do we know Shakespeare wasn't just a big softy and liked to write love stories? Maybe he wasn't trying to make a political statement. And she thought I was just a rabble-rouser, but I just wanted to know, where are you coming up with all of this? You can say anything. Well, that's what we do sometimes with Scripture, and maybe go too far. But in John, he tells you, I'm using signs to explain Jesus, so you need to be thinking about maybe that represents something else. So remember, John is written at the end of the first century. People have been following Jesus for a while. He's probably the last apostle that's around, and they're saying, we've read Matthew, and we've read Mark, and we've read Luke, and we're following Jesus, and we love Jesus. Tell us more about Jesus. And these people that have been studying and learning and following Jesus for all this time get to the very first sign, and he says the third day. Is there something significant about the third day to a follower of Jesus? What is it? He rose on the third day. Now, if you're a Christian reading this, if you're a follower of Jesus reading this, and you read on the third day, you're going to say, wait, what did you say? There's something there he's wanting you to think about. On the third day, he says there was a wedding, and it could even be that it's the third day of the wedding that is really what this is he's talking about. But nonetheless, it's something that he throws in there to make you think about something. Yes, ma'am. I've got written above that the question, what? Third day significant to followers. No, you're fine. I want to write those kind of things in my Bible to make me think, and I hope you will too in your little book, to make me think about that next time I go through and read that. So let me explain a little bit about Jewish wedding feasts, because they're absolutely nothing like weddings that we have today. Some of you guys are thinking, oh, I know weddings. You have to go and sit dressed up for 3 hours, and then you drink some punch and eat some mints and a piece of cake with too much icing on it, and but nothing like that, okay? Weddings in the first century in Near Eastern Jewish neighborhoods were a big deal for the community. And we think about small towns, and maybe we think of Martin or Gleason or Dresden or something like that, but the small towns in that time were even smaller than that. They were villages of maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 families, whatever it might have been, but we're talking really low numbers. But this would have been a big deal for that little village and that little community. The way that wedding feasts took place in that day and time was that usually it was the groom's family that put on, some of you fathers of the bride are saying, ooh, that'd be nice, but it was the groom's father and mother that put on the wedding feast. And what would happen is all of the friends of the bride, they would go over to her house and help her get all gussied up and ready for the big feast, the big wedding festival that they would have. And this is why, like you read Song of Songs, and there's this chorus of females that are talking back and forth to the woman that's going to be the bride there. And then when you get to the wedding, there's Solomon coming along in his chariot. And well, that's what happens is that when it's time for the wedding, and the brides didn't always know when that was going to be. That's why, like Jesus' parable of the wise and foolish virgins, they just had to be ready. So all of her friends are there helping her get gussied up. And then the groom leads this big parade through the town, and everybody comes along, and they go down to the bride's house, and they pick her up, and then they head off back to the groom's house or wherever they had it, usually at the groom's house. And it would start what would be a several-day event. Sometimes 2 days, 3 days, up to 7 days. If you were royalty or really a big deal, maybe 14 days. But what they would do is they would hire someone who would be in charge of the event, the person that is going to kind of coordinate it. And it wasn't a woman saying, all right, you go next, like we do today. It was a guy that was usually someone close to the family that they trusted. Later on in the translation years, about verse 9 or 10, I think it is, it'll say something like a head waiter or the master of the feast. Master of the feast is probably a better translation of who it is, because when I think head waiter, I think somebody that's still under someone. But this guy was literally the master of the feast, so that the parents could, just enjoy the event. And he's the one that made sure they had plenty of supplies for everybody that was coming. He was the one that, like whenever it was time for a toast, he would get everybody's attention, and he would toast the bride, or he would toast the groom, or he would toast the bride's family or the groom's family, or whatever it might be. And he would be the one that would say, all right, now bring on the next course for the meal, or whatever it was. But he was in charge of it all. And the idea behind, I want to read a text. This is from a book that was written, not inspired, but a book that was written about 200 BC. It's called Sirach, and in chapter 32, verses 1 and 2, he says, if thou hast been appointed banquet master, do not exalt thyself. Be to them as one of themselves. Supply their needs, and afterwards recline, that thou mayest rejoice on their account and receive consideration for politeness. In other words, you make sure you do your work and then enjoy what's going on, because it was such a it was all about honor. You think about, you watch movies from the Far East, or you learn anything about culture from the Far East, and you know how much honor and the family name means to them. Well, this is Near East, and it's the same thing. It's all about honor and the family name. And if you didn't do your job, you dishonored your family, you dishonored the groom's family, you dishonored the bride's family. And there's even in the Mishnah, they wrote some specifics about how they could sue you and what they could sue you for, and all of those kinds of things. It was a really big deal. So if you're the master of the feast, you want to make sure that everything is perfect. So they'd have this big feast, they'd have a ceremony of some sort. At some point, the bride and the groom would sneak off to the bridal chambers for the beginning of the honeymoon, and then the next morning, the mama of the bride would go upstairs and get their bed sheets and bring downstairs and show everyone that her daughter was pure, and they would all celebrate and have more feasting and celebration, and it would just go on for some time. So when you're at a multi-day event like that with a bunch of people from the community, you need a lot of supplies. And if supplies are low, it would be a really bad thing. So that's kind of the background of what's going on with what's happening. So notice it says that in verse 1 here, he says, on the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And remember, verse 43 said they were going north, so they stop along the way as they get into Galilee to Cana. Jesus' mother was there. We're going to find out later on that his brothers were there also. And so Jesus also was invited with his disciples, which is kind of just thrown in there a little bit. But I want you to stop and think about what that means and what it says about Jesus. A lot of our movies and shows and whatnot that I've ever seen about Jesus, we typically, maybe it's the way you picture Jesus, is having his hand folded, and he's always walking around with this air above, but that's not Jesus. The Word became flesh and dwelt among men. And he's God, but he became a man. And so he had friends, and he had relationships with different individuals that some were close and some were not as close, but he had the emotions that we have. He had the pain and the joy. He had the hunger and the enjoyment, all of those things. And it's hard for us maybe to picture. Our weddings are very formal, and we practice, how you walk and how you step, and all of those kinds of things. And it was just a big party for them. And they would dance, and they would eat, and they would have fun together, and they'd talk about things. And when they danced, it was typically all the women over here in a circle and all the men over here in a circle, and they're just having a big time. And they're sitting around tables eating meal after meal, and Jesus is there with his brothers and all these friends of his. And I'm sure there was conversations like, hey, you remember that time whenever Daddy took us fishing down at the... Hey, you remember that time when Mama got on to you because you... Hey, you remember when we were boys and we went off camping for... All of those kinds of conversations that Jesus is having, and they're laughing. We think about the different characteristics we have. Where do we think we came up with a sense of humor? We got it from God. You don't think God has a sense of humor? Have you ever seen a duck-billed platypus? God's got a sense of humor. And you're seeing the humanity of Jesus. And we see it in John more than we do the other gospel accounts. But we're seeing Jesus as a man. And so he's there at the wedding with his disciples. And then it says, when the wine ran out, is the way that the ESV translated. The word there just means to run short. It's the same word that you see in Romans chapter 3 and verse 23 when he says, all have sinned and come short or fallen short. That's the same word. So there's just not enough. The guy probably thought, whoever this is that's the headmaster, the master of the feast, the head waiter, however yours is translated, he probably thought he had enough, but they ran short. And so when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, now this is one of those things that would have been kind of hush-hush, that you would have not wanted everybody to have known. It's kind of like whenever, you're having maybe a Super Bowl party or, football party or whatever you're doing, and more people show up and you realize, and your wife kind of pulls you off in the kitchen and says, run down to Domino's and get some more pizza because we don't, you didn't want anybody to know. So maybe Mary was friends with one of the servants, or maybe she was close to the families, one of the families. But in any event, she knows, and she says to Jesus, they have no wine. All right, now let's stop and think about for just a minute about the importance of wine. I told you from the get-go that in John there's what happens, and then there's this meaning that we're going to get to in just a minute, kind of a punchline of what it means. And then below that, it's like layers of an onion. There's something back in the Old Testament that it's pointing to. So turn back in your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 25. Isaiah chapter 25. We're just going to look at a couple of places that really emphasizes this, I think. Isaiah chapter 25, and we'll begin, let's see here. We'll begin in about verse 6, I think. Maybe I can just pull it up here and show everybody. That would be good if I could do that. Yeah, that's where I still had it up. Isaiah 25, start down here at about verse 6. On the mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine, well refined. We'll read a few more verses in just a second, but think about what he's saying here, is that when the Messiah comes, what he's saying is there's going to be this idea of God providing and lavish blessings that are poured out on people. And almost every time in the Old Testament where you see the idea of there being a lot of blessings from God, material blessings, plenty, almost every time grapes are involved. Wine's involved. You remember whenever the spies went in to spy out the land of milk and honey? They didn't bring out milk and honey. What did they bring out? These big old bunches of grapes, right? And so you've got this over and over. Notice what he says here. He says, and he, talking about the Lord of hosts, verse 7, he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death. It's interesting that he's talking about you're going to have this big banquet feast of all of this bounty, lots of food and drink. And while you're swallowing, God's going to swallow something up. He's going to swallow this veil that covers all of mankind. What is that veil? He says He's going to swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away all tears. The reproach of His people He will take away from the earth, for the Lord has spoken. It will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We've waited for Him that He might save us. This is the Lord. We've waited for Him. Let us be glad and rejoice in His salvation. He's going to swallow up death. There's going to be no more tears. Have you heard that verse before? You probably heard that line in Revelation, but guess where John got it when he wrote Revelation? From Isaiah chapter 25. See, this idea of bounty, and it's in the last chapter of Amos, and it's in the last chapter of Zechariah, and it's in all of these different places where he's looking forward and saying, this is what it's going to be like when the Messiah comes. There's going to be bounty, and the way he shows that is there's going to be grapes, there's going to be wine. And then the other side, here's another layer for you of the onion. That red colored juice of wine also in the Bible is connected to what other red colored liquid? Blood. Now, maybe all that's coincidence. I don't know, but I can't imagine the Lord God of hosts saying, hey, we'll trick them with this. We'll put a bunch of coincidences in there, right? That's what a Hebrew mind, when they read this, would be saying, oh, that reminds me of Isaiah 25. That reminds me of the last chapter of Amos. And so that's the situation that's going on here when we're in John chapter 2 and he starts talking about wine, what they're going to be thinking about. So he says they have wine, and Jesus says to her, woman, and a lot of people make a lot of insinuations about that when he says woman. He's not being disrespectful here. It's actually a way that they would talk to someone of authority, someone that they respected by calling her this. If you remember, when Jesus gets on the cross and he's telling John to take care of Mary and telling Mary that John's going to take care of her, what does he say? Son, behold your mother, mother or woman, behold your son. See? So he says, woman, what does that have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. All right, John is now introducing something that we're going to see repeated over time. And I've got some passages up here listed above that you may want to write down. In chapter 7 and verse 6, chapter 7 and verse 30, chapter 8 and verse 20, chapter 12 and verse 23. There's all of these different times that Jesus says, my time's not yet come. I'm on God's time schedule about when this is all going to happen. And then you get to chapter 13, and he says that he knows his hour was at hand. And then chapter 17, he tells his disciples, my hour is at hand. It's getting closer to the point that he's going to be put to death. And so he's telling her, you know, I don't want to speed up the process because we're on God's timeline and not mine. And so notice that even though he tells that to his mama, she tells the servants, she didn't even pay attention to what Jesus said. She says, do what he said. See, when she came in and she said, we're out of wine, that's a statement. She's not asked Jesus to do anything. But if you know mama language, sometimes they tell you something when they tell you something, right? Like mama would come in the living room and she would say, there's somebody's dirty clothes. She's not making an observation. What's she doing? You get your tail up and get them dirty clothes, all right? Well, that's what his mama's doing. We're out of wine. You can fix it. You can help them out. And so his mother tells the servants, and this is the same word that is translated deacon in other places, but she tells these servants, do whatever he tells you. Which again is one of those statements that John puts in there because it's part of the account that he's talking about, but it's also a really important thing for us to think about. Are you willing to do what he tells you, reader? Are you at that point that you believe who Jesus is and you're willing to follow him? And so, verse 6, now there were 6 stone water jars, and this, again, would resonate with the Jews because he goes on to talk about that they were there for the Jewish rites of purification for these ceremonial cleansings that they would have done. They hauled water in. And then he says each holding about 20 or 30 gallons. And that's an estimation of about how big these pots were. But if you've ever seen a 30-gallon trash can, that's a pretty good size. In fact, I was afraid I'd get in trouble if I brought trash cans in the auditorium, but I almost brought some in here because we've got some around the building. But that's a lot. They have these 6 pots. So they look around, they say, what do we got to, when you're out of something, you use whatever you got on hand, right? We had one year when we were in Denver, they were predicting massive blizzard conditions starting on overnight between Saturday and Sunday. They were predicting as much as 30 to 35 inches of snow. In fact, I think what they really did was it was something like 12 to 48 inches. And in Denver, when you heard that, that's basically the weatherman's way of saying we have no idea what this front's going to do, you know. But they were pretty confident it was going to be whiteout conditions, hard wind blowing, and all of that kind of stuff. And so everybody shut down everything, called off everything, including everybody called off church and everything. So we're just going to worship at our house. We had one of our students that lived up in the mountains that came down on Saturday to stay the night with us before they canceled services so that he could make it 2 services on Sunday morning. And so we just decided our 5 in our family and Samuel, we're going to worship together. And I thought, well, we've got a bunch of people in our neighborhood that we've been inviting to church and they hadn't come yet. Maybe they'll come over to our house. And so I put it on Facebook, hoping some of our neighbors would come. Well, none of our neighbors came, but that next morning we got probably 18 or 20 inches of snow, and I'm out there shoveling off on Sunday morning, and Melody comes out and she said, hey, there's some people from church wanting to know if they can come over and worship with us. And I said, well, sure. Well, next thing you know, more and more kept calling, and we had about 30 people show up. And Melody said, well, I hate to send them away without feeding them lunch. And so we worshiped all together in our living room there, and Melody had fixed tortilla soup the night before. So, you know, if you've got a half a pot of soup, you can pour in some water, and it makes it a full pot of soup. And so we did that, and she had a big bag of baked potatoes, and we threw them in the oven, and we made a little pot of chili to put on the potatoes, and we ordered some pizzas, and we just did with what we had. By the way, all of the people that were there that Sunday, still, we talk about our favorite day of worship we ever had. It felt like, as close as I'll ever know, I guess, first century worship, you know. That was before all the stay-at-home kind of stuff, so it was a big deal, you know. But anyway, you just make do with what you got. So Jesus looks around, and there's some water pots over there, and he says, we'll make do with what we got. Now, Jesus could have just said, let there be wine, right? But he didn't, because he's trying to make them see something here. So he tells the servants, verse 7, fill the jars with water, and they fill them to the brim. Not with coffee, that's the old commercial, you know, fill it to the rim with brim. They fill it to the brim with water. Why is that significant? Because if it's completely full, how much can you put in there? So nobody can, you know, I use these, I don't drink water like I should. I get these little squirt things that is orange flavored or lemonade flavor, whatever, and there's just enough room in the bottle that I can squirt a couple of squirts in there and it makes the water taste good. Well, it's all the way at the rim. He couldn't put a little wine in there, a little frozen wine bottle or something and make everybody fooled. It's completely filled to the rim. And they filled them to the brim, and he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. Again, it's interesting. Jesus doesn't say the magic words. He doesn't, if you remember watching the Bozo Show, those of you that grew up in the 80s and 90s and remember Wizzo, the clown that had the little necklace and he would do over whatever. He didn't do anything like that. He didn't wave a magic wand. He didn't touch it. He didn't lay his hand on the side of the pot. He just said, bring some water. They brought some water. He said, now dip some out and go take it to the... And if I'm one of the servants, I'm probably thinking, you're fixing to get me beheaded is what you're, I'm going to bring him a glass of water and he's going to smack me in the face. But when the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast calls the bridegroom, and he said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine unto now. And if I were you, I would get one of your little pencils or pens, and I would put a little box around, you have kept the good wine until now, because that's the punchline of this particular sign. And we'll come back to it in just a moment. But then he wraps it up and says, this, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee. Actually, it's the first sign he did in Cana of Galilee. Some people think that this is the first sign Jesus did, but what he literally says is it's the first one that he did in Cana of Galilee. Maybe it was his first one overall, but it was certainly the first one he did in Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. All right, there's a lot in that last couple of verses there. What is this sign? This is a sign. He says it's the first of his signs that indicate. What is this sign supposed to show us? All of the signs, John 20, 30 through 31, is supposed to make us believe that Jesus is the Christ. Well, notice what happens after the sign. What did his disciples do? Believe. That's the purpose of the signs. So draw a circle around sign and draw a line down to believe, and draw a circle around it, because you're going to see over and over in John, this is what happens. There's a sign and then people believe. Now, did the disciples understand everything, what was going on? Absolutely not. But they're starting to trust in him more and believe in him more. It's also interesting that it says that in this he manifested his glory. Has he talked about glory connected with Jesus so far in John? Has he? Anybody? I don't know. Don't put me. Somebody, everybody, flip back up to verse 14, I think it is. And notice what he says in verse 14 of chapter 1. I should have said that before. In chapter 1 and verse 14, I think it is, yeah. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his what? What kind of glory? Glory as of the only Son of the Father. How did he show that glory? Well, you know the first thing he did to show his glory? To show his radiance, to show his awesomeness, to show who he was. He said, fill up 6 of these big old drums of water all the way to the brim. Now dip some out and go and show it to the master. So, that's a cool story, isn't it? Notice what happens after that, though. If I can scroll back down to chapter 2 real quick. After his disciples believe, it says, after this he went down to Capernaum, which is what Jesus is going to adopt as his hometown, with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. How many times have you heard it said, and maybe you've said it yourself, if I could see one of those signs, I would believe. You heard that before? I wouldn't be so quick to say that, because there were lots of people that saw the signs, and some believed and some didn't believe. His brothers were there. But his brothers, the disciples are going to believe. It just said that. But the brothers aren't going to believe yet. In fact, when we get over to chapter 7, they're going to make fun of him, and they're going to say, well, if you're who you say you are, won't you go into town, go into Jerusalem, and tell them who you are, big boy? And they said that sarcastically because the text says they did not believe in him. But the purpose is to make them believe. Some are going to, some are not. So that's a cool story. In 3 minutes, what does it mean to me? Well, a couple lessons I think is important from this. Number one, in John chapter 2, in these first 15 verses or so, we see the humanity of Jesus. Jesus is a man who had the emotions and the joy and the feelings and the love and the concern and care. Why did Jesus ultimately, he did this to cause people to believe? But he tells his mother, it's not my time yet, but he does it anyway because he's so concerned about people. And we need to be concerned about people. We need to understand that it's okay to have fun. Sometimes as Christians, you would think that, we've outlawed fun. I don't know. We sing, I'm happy today. I've got the joy, joy, joy. Sound like a record player that's dying. We ought to be happy. We ought to be enjoying each other and enjoying fellowship and enjoying life together. So we see the humanity of Jesus. Second thing that I think is important from this text is that he says that what he made was so good, it was the best that he saved for last. Everything that Jesus does is good. In chapter 1, it said that he was the creator of everything, wasn't anything made that was not made by him. And after everything that was made in Genesis chapter 1, what was said about it? It is good. Then he made man and he said, it is very good. I don't know what he said after he made a woman. Probably that's really good. I don't know. But everything he does is good. And that's why he deserves our very best. And what's amazing to me, especially with men, is that we want to be the best at everything that we do. I want to be the best golf player. I want to kill the most ducks. I want to have the nicest truck. I want to be the best at my profession. I want to have the yard of the month in my whatever it is that we do, we want to be the best until it comes to following Jesus and we say, that's good enough. That's close enough. Why is it, men, that we don't challenge ourselves, and I'm talking especially to men, why don't we challenge ourselves to be the best follower of Jesus? Because he deserves it. Another thing that I think is a great lesson from this is that Jesus has control over time. If you think about it, it's really not so miraculous that water would be turned into wine because it happens every day. You go to your backyard and you plant some seeds, and the vine's going to sprout up, and water's going to be sucked out of the ground. If you can get water more commonly than every 37 days like we have, water's going to be sucked out of the ground, and it's going to be put into grapes as what? Not water, but juice, right? That's what grapevines do every day of the week, is turn water to juice. So what Jesus did wasn't really miraculous, except for the fact that he did it like that. Time means nothing to the one who's always been. And then the final lesson I think that's important for us from this is, when you see the signs, what are you going to do with Jesus? Are you going to believe that he's the Christ? Or are you going to turn away from the evidence? And make no mistake, John is telling you in this book, I don't want you to take my word for it. One of the reasons why this is an important case here, this is an important piece of testimony or witness or evidence, is at a wedding in Cana. He gives us the specifics. And he says to his original audience, there's people in that area that was there. Their mamas and daddies were there. Their grandma and grandpas were there. This wasn't something done in a cave that nobody knew about. Jesus proved who He was. So will we follow Him. All right, that's pretty deep. But it's pretty cool, too. So, you've got a couple of weeks now to kind of mull that over. That's the side of John chapter 2, verses 1 through 15 that we rarely get to, but that we should. Okay? Now, next, he's going to work right into another sign that's connected back to chapter 1, and he's going to set up the conversation he's going to have in chapter 3. So, you got a couple of weeks. It'd be a good opportunity for you to mark your keywords in your John book if you haven't already. It'd be a good opportunity for you to read chapter 2 and chapter 3 in its entirety and be ready for those studies, okay? All right, before we dismiss, we have a few announcements that we want to make, and then George is going to lead us in a closing prayer. And